Our text today comes from Mark chapter 15, verses 1 through 15. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Today we're continuing in our journey during this Lenten season of Jesus' final days. And a couple weeks ago, his final hours on his last day. A couple weeks ago, we began in the Garden of Gethsemane, where there was around midnight, and it was Jesus' prayer and the betrayal of Judas and his arrest. Last week, the location moved to the home of the high priest Caiaphas, where Jesus was brought on the sham trial, and Peter denied him outside the home. Now today, we move to the third location, which is the governor's palace. So let's set the scene. The Sanhedrin, which is the ruling council, a group of Jewish religious leaders, they want Jesus dead. They have coordinated his betrayal and his arrest. They put together this sham trial. They have produced false witnesses, and they have pronounced a death sentence upon Jesus without convicting him of any crime. Well, why would they do that? Well, they just hated Jesus. He represented a threat to their power, to the status quo. He represented a threat to their influence. Jesus challenged their authority. He exposed their self-righteousness. And they were shocked and infuriated by his claims of divinity, that he would blaspheme God, committing the greatest of sins by claiming to be the Lord. But the Sanhedrin, this group of religious leaders, they had a real problem. They had several problems of what they wanted to do with Jesus. The first is this: they had no authority to execute Jesus. They had no legal authority to do that. Only the Romans, who were the occupying government of the day, could do that. So they wanted to kill Jesus, but they couldn't. Second, the Romans could care less about the religion of the Jews. That didn't matter to them at all. So they couldn't bring Jesus to whoever on the charges of blaspheming. So they had to change the charges from theological to political. And that's just what they did. And they said, Jesus is the self-proclaimed king of the Jews, and he's guilty of rebellion and treason against Rome, the Roman Empire. And they were also looking to avoid responsibility. Jesus was popular in certain circles, and they don't want to take blame for his death. And We always see this. They're careful about when to arrest him and when to do the things they want to do because they don't want to be attached to Jesus' death and demise. And so if there's an opportunity to shift the blame to the already hated Romans, they're happy to do that. So all of these factors lead the Sanhedrin to the doorstep of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is a cruel and heartless man. Secular history records him being just a really awful human being. Now, Pilate, as the Roman governor over Jerusalem in that area, it was his job as kind of the arm of the Roman Empire to keep the Jews under control. But he just could never seem to quite do it. Previous to what we're reading today, Pilate had a budget shortfall. And he solved it by pillaging the Jerusalem temple treasury for funds. Well, as you can imagine, a lot of the Jews got really angry about that and they began to riot. So then Pilate sends Roman soldiers to stop the riot, and they end up beating many Jews to death. Well, this news did not go over well in Jerusalem or in Rome. And at another point, the Jews were so exasperated with Pilate for decorating his palace and the city with idols that their religious leaders actually made a direct appeal to the Roman Emperor Caesar. Well, Caesar was less than thrilled to hear about this bickering and the animosity that was going on in Jerusalem, and he directly ordered him to remove the idols. So this creates even more tension between Pilate and the chief priests, and it's a very tense situation. So Pilate, his position as governor, it's already on shaky ground. The relationships between Rome and the Jews is awful. That's kind of the context when Pilate is woken up on an early Friday morning to yet another very potentially explosive issues. The chief priests have brought to him a man named Jesus. He is bound by the temple guards and they are seeking Jesus' execution. Now they claim to Pilate that Jesus has been causing riots all over the place and now he's brought him to Jerusalem, that he's laying claim to a kingship, that he is actively subverting Caesar and Roman rule. So what is Pilate to do? Well, he doesn't care, again, at all about the Jewish religion, practices, and beliefs. That's not even on his radar. He has no concern for it all. And he hates the chief priests. They're so incredibly difficult for him to work with. They're making him look bad, causing all kinds of trouble. So he's not going to want to give them just whatever they want. But at the same time, he can't ignore a potential threat to Rome. So Pilate interviews Jesus. It's not obvious in the account in Mark, but as we read the Gospels together, as we harmonize them, we see that Jesus appeared before Pilate that morning 3 separate times. Pilate interviews him 3 times. And he quickly determines that there is absolutely no reason why he should execute Jesus. And in fact, he declares that Jesus is completely innocent on multiple occasions. Listen to this declaration from Luke 23. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him." Even the corrupt and heartless Pilate perceives that Jesus is no threat at all to the Romans. And he is only there because he has perceived that they are envious of him. It says right there in Mark 15:10, This is not about justice. This is not about preserving civil order. This is about a vendetta. This is personal. It is deeply, deeply personal. Now, the repetition of Jesus' innocence throughout these trials is vital to the story. It's vital to the role that Jesus is going to play. Because as all this is going on, if you notice in verse 6, it talks about a feast. There is the Passover feast going on. It is the story of Israel's deliverance from slavery out of Egypt some 1,500 years earlier. And there was a pure, spotless lamb that was sacrificed and its blood was shed. And through that, the miracle of the Passover happened and the Israelites were released into a freedom. And here, Jesus is portrayed, he's identified as the pure, spotless Passover lamb. He is the ultimate Passover lamb. And he is going to be sacrificed, and his blood is going to be shed for not just the freedom of Israel from Egypt, but for the freedom of all people, for the whole world, and freedom not from an oppressive government, but from death. So Passover is going on. And it was the tradition of the Roman Empire at that time that they would allow one convicted felon to go free. I think just try to throwing them a bone, trying to keep the peace, trying to keep the favor of the people. And the Jews could choose who this person was going to be. Enter Barabbas. Barabbas is a character that appears in all four Gospels, but we know very little of him. All we know is that, excuse me, he is guilty of murder. He was part of a rebellion, an insurrection, an uprising against the Romans. And he is convicted. He is on death row. And it's interesting that the very charges that have brought against Jesus, insurrection and rebellion, are the very ones that Barabbas has actually been found guilty of. And the penalty for Barabbas, the penalty for rebellion against Rome, is death on a cross. Crucifixion. That is what is awaiting Barabbas. Now, as all this is going on, a crowd has gathered. And Pilate is going to give the crowd a choice. Whom will they set free? Jesus, whom he finds to be completely innocent, or the wicked and notorious Barabbas? So the chief priests get to work right away. They start working the crowd. And these are people with great influence and great sway. And the people are kind of like sheep. They'll do whatever they're told. They'll follow whatever they're commanded to do. And so they have no real devotion to Jesus. They sang his praises earlier this week, but now if the chief priests are telling them something else, they're going to believe that. So when Pilate gets to the point, this critical moment when he asks for whom shall he release, this unexpected roar goes up for Barabbas. So Pilate turns to the crowd and says, but what about Jesus? What should I do with him? And they all yell, crucify him. It's a single united voice. Crucify him. Now Pilate he's confused because he's about why? He doesn't understand it. He goes, what evil has he done? In verse 14, he can't wrap his mind around it. He goes, I guess it's one thing if they want Barabbas free, but why crucify Jesus? Like, what does anybody have against him? And the crowd never gives an answer. They never give a reason. They just continue to shout, crucify, crucify, crucify. Now, if you are confused by this turn of events, Romans chapter 1 gives us a theological framework that's going to help explain how all this could have happened. Romans 1 talks to us about the extent to which human nature has been corrupted by sin. In verse 18, we read that in our sin, we actively suppress the truth of God. We try to cover it up, to throw a blanket on top of the truth of who God is. And in verse 25 it says, we prefer in our sinful nature to exchange the truth of God for a lie. So there's suppression and exchanging. It's who we are. It's what we do as a fallen race. Nobody needs to teach us how to do it. It's just what we do. And these theological principles of suppressing the truth and exchanging who God is for a lie is never seen more clearly in history than here, when humanity is given a choice between the Holy Son of God, Jesus, and the wicked Barabbas. Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life, is bound up, and lies are spoken over him. A relentless parade of false witnesses. Lies, lies, lies. And they exchange the Son of God for a hardened criminal. Scripture is clear as we read through it that sinful creatures do not like a holy God, and nothing is going to be more repugnant to a fallen humanity than a sinless Redeemer. I don't know how many opportunities you've had to share Christ or let people know that you're a person of faith, but sometimes you'll hear people say something like this: "Oh, that's great, that's good for you, but I don't need that. I don't need Jesus." What they're really saying, in very thinly veiled language, is, I don't want him. Why don't I choose him? Why don't I trust in him? Why don't I follow him? Because I don't want him. And why don't I want him? Because I don't like him. I don't want him in my life. So as the church gathered sings the song, "Give Me Jesus," the crowd and the world sings the song, "Give me anybody but Jesus. Give me Barabbas." Well, the crowd is worked up into a frenzy, and in order to avoid a riot and the news of another disaster that would certainly make its way back to Rome, Pilate ultimately caves to the crowd. He releases Barabbas and he condemns Jesus to death. I wonder what that day was like for Barabbas. He wakes up on death row in a Roman prison, certainly aware that this could be his day. This could be the day he dies. For Barabbas, there was no process of parole or appeals for him to turn to. He didn't have any rights. It was over for him. There was no hope. He was a murderer who deserved death, and perhaps deep down he even knew that. Perhaps he woke up that morning imagining the flogging and the mocking and the eventual painful death on the cross that was soon coming. And then he realizes the day has come. The guards swing open the door to his cell and they drag him outside. Barabbas is at his end, and I can't imagine anything but fear and terror gripping his heart, knowing what lay before him. But then the most astonishing thing happens. He's released. His chains are removed and the guilty murderer is set free. Barabbas is given a full pardon. He's given a clean slate. Nothing can be held against him. No former crimes. He's no longer condemned. He's no longer on death row. How can this be? He's not paid his debt off to society. He hasn't done any good deeds to deserve, his newfound freedom. He hasn't served his punishment. And it's not like they went out and they actually found the real murderer and he was wrongfully convicted. He was guilty through and through. How can this be? Just then he sees the guards dragging another man to his death, Jesus of Nazareth. He's beaten and flogged and forced to carry a cross to his death. It's the very cross Barabbas had imagined carrying himself only moments earlier. So in this incredibly stunning turn of events, Jesus endures death, the death that Barabbas deserved, while Barabbas was given the freedom that Jesus deserved. And Jesus bore the shame and the guilt and the curse and the disgrace that Barabbas deserved. And in exchange, Barabbas was sent home a free man with a clean record. I think the reason that this story is in all four Gospels is that wherever the gospel is preached, that we are to clearly see ourselves in this exchange. Because what happens between Jesus and Barabbas is a visible demonstration of this far greater spiritual reality that was occurring between Jesus and humanity as he bore the cross. You see, you and I, we're Barabbas. We're sinners. We all are. There are none righteous, none that can please God according to our good works. And like Barabbas, we sit in a prison, but we sit in a spiritual prison, bound, helpless, awaiting the day when we will receive the just punishment that we deserve from an infinite, holy God. A God against whom we have committed treason and rebellion. And we sit on the death row of all death rows, waiting for God's judgment to come down and to condemn us to eternal punishment. But like Barabbas, an exchange is made possible. An exchange is offered. The gospel declares that if you repent of your sin, you turn away from it, and you trust in Jesus to save you from your sins, he will take your place. And he will get what you deserve, and you will get what he deserves. Jesus will be condemned, you will receive freedom. Jesus will get punished, you will get reward. Jesus will endure death, you will get life. Jesus will go through the agony of suffering of hell, and you will get heaven. It is the greatest exchange in all of history. And why? Why is any of this happening? Because of God's extraordinary love for you. Romans 5 explains why all this happens. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus offers out of sheer grace, not because of anything you've done, out of grace and love, he offers to carry your cross for you. It is the greatest offer ever given to anyone ever. And so the choice comes to you, it comes to me, it comes to all of us, is who is going to carry our cross? Who is going to bear the penalty for our sin? Either we will or Christ will do it on our behalf. And so I implore you, if you have not made this decision, to choose Christ, to turn to him in faith, to give him your life right in this moment, and to say, yes, Lord, carry my cross, bear my burden, endure my death, so that I might have life and freedom and hope. You know, the four Gospels, or really any other extra biblical sources, never tell us what ever happened to Barabbas. There's just no record anywhere. And so we're left to wonder, did he continue a life of violence? Did he take more lives? Did Barabbas die on another cross, a few months later for another crime he committed? Or did something change that day in his heart? When he was given this new life, this extra chance, I wonder if he was moved by that gift of freedom. I wonder if he turned his life around, that being grateful for this opportunity, he made a new life for himself. I wonder if he ever took the time to know who Jesus was, and that may one day that he put his faith in Jesus Christ. So it would not just be somebody who traded places with him on Good Friday, but somebody who traded places with him for all eternity. We don't know. We have no idea what happened. And I'm going to suggest that the Bible is silent on that on that very answer on purpose, because we are to insert ourselves in the story, and we need to kind of write our own ending, so to speak. And we each have a choice of what will we do with Christ? Will we accept him? Will we trust him? Will we believe in him? And if we do, what will we then do with this new life, this new freedom, this clean record? And that's the choice, I think, before us in this Lenten season as we consider this today, is who is Christ? And if I have trusted in him, what is my life? What is my life about? What direction am I walking? And is my life one of just gratitude and joy for Christ and all that he has done? And that's the question we are left with at the end of this text.